are we so drawn to Lincoln?
Oh God, that's hard to answer. You know, I think partly because he was the president of the United States during the Civil War. And the 6 years that I spent working on this, it became really clear to me that everything in American history, all the themes, the great themes of American history from the Revolutionary period, from the founding of the country, sort of flow directly into the Civil War. And then everything that we've become since flows out of it. It really is this kind of strange naval moment. It's the center, I think, in a way, still of American history. And so, of course, the person that was at the center of that center becomes an inescapable figure, and through accident or providence or whatever, he happens to have been our greatest president, one of our greatest writers, a moral visionary, and obviously one of the most remarkable people that ever lived. So I think that the fascination with him is both a function of his position in history, but also of who he was. And the sort of miracle of Lincoln is that that person showed up at that moment.
What did you come to think of his writing? I mean, we all know he's a good writer, as you said, but what, as one writer looking at another, did you come to see was the essence of his skill?
I mean, that's actually, Lincoln as a writer, I think, was my first point of entry long before Steven asked me to write this film. When I only knew what I had gathered from a couple of books about the Civil War, I read, I think in college, the second inaugural address and was astounded by it. You know, I think he's at an era when America was producing, you know, several of the greatest writers that have ever lived, Dickinson and Hawthorne and Melville and Emerson and Whitman. Lincoln was clearly drinking the same Kool-Aid as the rest of them. I mean, he really was a prose poet of, I think, absolute genius. And certainly in the Gettysburg Address and in the second inaugural address and in the, I think it's the 1863, a long passage in the 1863 annual message to Congress, and in several letters and smaller speeches. It's some of the most beautiful prose ever written in English.
And he wrote more powerfully when he wrote more briefly, didn't he?
Well, yeah, I think so. I mean, he tended to get, the writing got shorter and shorter and shorter as he went along. Yeah, I mean, he gave an immensely important speech and a really fascinating speech on April 12th, I think, when he talks about Reconstruction in Louisiana. It's where he mentions giving a few black men in Louisiana the vote. The first time an American president talked about giving the vote. The speech went on and on and on, and it's very technical, and people sort of hated it. The Emancipation Proclamation famously has only one really good sentence, which I believe either Seward or Chase claimed that they contributed to it. It's a very, very technical document. He knew, you know, he wasn't primarily a poet. He was the president of the United States, and there was a technical demand on his writing. But he was, like Grant, who then came along and really, in a way, transformed American letters. These were the guys at the beginnings of modernism. I mean, there's the sense of brevity as having a power. The most astonishing sentence I think he ever wrote is in the middle of the second inaugural address, which ends with these two paragraphs that are just, you know, transcendent and really may be the most beautiful two paragraphs in political oratory in world history. But in the middle of it, he talks about the coming of the war, and then there's this one sentence, and the war came. And it just hangs there. And you think about people in March of 1865 listening to this man say, and the war came. You know, the entire horror of the war is contained in those words. And it's stunning, the command of English to know that you don't add any adjectives, you don't say anything more than that. And you know, he was an autodidact. He never went to school without his stepmother, to whom we all owe, you know, Sarah Bush. We all owe, the country owes an unpayable debt of gratitude, because she saw that this was a 7-year-old boy that she inherited, who was a wild animal, was a genius, and she made sure that he got books to read. But like a lot of autodidacts, you know, you build an entire intellectual universe out of, you know, a few simple tools. And Lincoln didn't, you know, he said famously, I never read a novel. I started Ivanhoe once and I couldn't finish it. He liked hearing Dickens read out loud, but I think that was because of the theatricality. He had a couple of things: the King James Bible, the plays of Shakespeare, the poems of Burns, a couple of poems that aren't so good by 19th century American bad poets, and things like Euclid. So you know, he's I think a very, very great writer. He's idiosyncratic. He has an incredible sense of rhythm. In the Gettysburg Address, I love the way that he keeps using the word here, H-E-R-E, over and over again, here, 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 because he's sort of standing on the ground where this thing happened and saying, you know, connecting us not to the heavens, but to the earth that we're standing on. You know, the more you study it, the more rewarding his writing becomes.
He is obviously many factors, many degrees beyond a larger-than-life figure in our own American history.
Yeah.
What was challenging about that, to get through the mythology and the fiction and the tales?
I mean, in a certain sense, once we hired Daniel, nothing was challenging because Daniel did so much of that.
Did he work on the script with you?
He did actually for the last year of before we started filming. I mean, the shape of the script and the scenes were all there, but and Daniel left what other people were saying alone, but we talked at least once a week for a very long stretch of that year. Going over what he was saying and making some changes. The big long speech at the cabinet that he makes for in the cabinet, he told me at the very beginning, he said, I don't want you to do, he knows that I like to rewrite, and he said, I want you to leave that speech alone, don't touch it, I won't do any rewrites, that's what it's going to be. So I left it completely alone. Stephen agreed, and I even stopped reading it. So when I heard him do it on set, when we were filming it, it was kind of new to me because I hadn't looked at it in a year. But we went through everything else in the script that Lincoln says over and over and over. And there were stories that Daniel had read that Lincoln had told that he really liked, and we tried to find places to put them. At one point he texted me. He doesn't do email, but he likes to text. And he texted me and said, I like the word disenthrall, which I think Lincoln uses in one of the annual messages to Congress. And he said, can we find a place in the script to use so I can say disenthrall? So that was like a game. I had to look around and say, well, where could he possibly? And, you know, who wouldn't want to say disenthrall if you have a chance to? So.
But were you conscious of the fact that you were trying to humanize a mythological giant?
Well, you know, if you're going to write a drama, you have to have human beings in the drama. The drama only works if they're recognizable people and if their core conflicts are identifiable and readable and you can kind of get what they're struggling with. And so had we failed to make Lincoln come to life, you know, feel like a flesh and blood person, if he had just been in the film as a kind of a monument, the film would have failed. So that was the terror that I certainly had. Stephen had it. Daniel had it. I think Daniel said no twice before saying yes. You know, he's not only mythologized, as you said, but the face is so preposterously familiar. It's on the penny. It's every used car commercial near President's Day. You know, it's almost like a joke to put on the stovepipe hat and the beard. And you know, at various points I thought, oh my God, I mean, there's going to be somebody, I was hoping it would be Daniel, but I didn't know. Somebody's going to be wearing an Abraham Lincoln suit, and we're going to be trying to tell people that this is actually Lincoln. You know, I struggled for about a year trying to get inside enough so that I felt like I could claim him as a character. I never really said to myself, this is Lincoln. I said, this is my character of Abraham Lincoln. But to get to something that felt like I was writing a man who was capable of doing the things Lincoln was capable of doing and who sounded like what we know of Lincoln and so on. But I come from the Deep South. I grew up in Louisiana.
Lake Charles,
Louisiana. Yes, and that helped.
Why did it help?
Because I think Lincoln was a Southerner, really, basically. He was born in Kentucky, then he went to Indiana and Illinois, but I think he had deep Southern roots. His mother and his father were both Kentuckians, and Mary was also from Kentucky. And I think his Southern identification helped a lot. So there was a certain kind of speech that I think I grew up listening to that made it, I was comfortable with it. There are ways in which, I share some of his likes.
Such as?
Well, Shakespeare is his favorite writer. Shakespeare is
Right.
my favorite writer. Anybody who likes writing thinks Shakespeare is the best. He liked Robert Burns. Robert Burns was one of my father's favorite poets, and I adore Robert Burns. He loved going to the theater. He really loved actors and acting.
That I didn't realize when I started reading about Lincoln, that he really did like it. They went often as they could.
Over and over. I mean, it's amazing. It's just any time he had a spare second, he was criticized for it sometimes, but anytime he had a spare second, he would go either to the opera or to theater, but he loved theater much more. And I think one of the great revelations in Daniel's performance is that when he does the second inaugural address at the end of the film, he used the language of the 19th century stage, these big gestures, and what part of Daniel's genius is that he doesn't make Lincoln into a greater actor than he probably was, but he uses them effectively in the speech, and I think that must be the way the speech was delivered.